So, way back when I was really starting to get into a YouTube kick again. This like early on, I was just doing like really like simple gameplay stuff. Really didn't do too much. Didn't take it too seriously. The moment that I really started taking a serious look into YouTube, of my own dismay and of things that I'm trying to correct as time has gone on, although I still feel differently about some things than others, was Gamergate. You know, and anybody who is aware of Gamergate understands exactly what that entails. And I was on the side of journalistic integrity. And it never really went beyond that. I know a lot of people went into the women-hating route. There are people out there that I specifically didn't like that were part of the Gamergate crowd that was for diversity and inclusion and that kind of stuff, which I've always been for. That part of me never changed, even at my worst case scenario, because I used to be listening to a lot of very right-wing people like your Ben Shapiro's or Steven Crowder's. I fell into that trap. And even then, I never thought that diversity shouldn't be a thing. My outlook for a long time was literally just like, I don't think we should be forcing it. We should be letting it just do it on its own time, because it was. I truly do believe that as time has gone on, we have been including more and more. Now, back then, I thought that we shouldn't be trying really hard to just kind of really shoehorn that in there. The difference that I have now compared to then is that I do feel like we need to be pushing, but it doesn't need to be something that's like we have to like go out there and force people to accept it. I think what we should be doing is just being very open and being very like if somebody wants to be a part of something, you just immediately go, sure, you're in. Instead of being like, we have to put this person in because she is this or because this person's like a part of the LGBT. It shouldn't just be, we have to put this person in. It should be, if they want a part in, you open the door for them. That's what I think. It shouldn't be you push them through the door. No, it should be you open the door, and if they want to step through, they step through. That's my different thing now. One of the people, though, as I mentioned earlier, that I was very, very negative towards, and I've mentioned it several times, both on the podcast and I believe here, I'm not sure if on the stream I have before, was Anita and Feminist Frequency. And to this day, I'm still not 100% sure if I do have any changes towards how I feel about her. Now, that being said, it's not her directly. Feminist Frequency is up in the airwaves again, because normally at E3 every year, they would have their list of games that were shown and would show, okay, this is how many of these games featured a female, a male, like and like multiple choices and stuff like that. And every year they would always say the same thing. Look how few games feature women. And the reality is that it was not the small percentage they would say, because they were never specifically saying it was just specifically one gendered character and this was the gender. The reality is that more than half of all games were allowing you to play as a woman. It's just most of them were allowing you to choose between male or female. Now, a lot more games at the time seemed to push that if it was going to be one gender, it was going to be more male. And I do agree that there should be games that feature more female-only characters. However, I don't feel like it's something that is a big deal if it doesn't, because the reality is that most games now, like I said, over half, give you the option. So you can put yourself in that game and associate with those characters. Now, this year, they decided to still do that. And this year was a much better improvement. And immediately, this is the kind of stuff that gets my attention. I said this in the one video I think is still left on my channel where I talk about one of our videos, where it's they're making progress, but it's not good enough. This is a similar thing. The title of this article is being more video games featured women this year. Will it last? Why does it have to immediately go to, but is this just a fluke? Why can't it just be more video games featured women this year, and that's it? Or just say like finally, or amazing, like anything like that. It's always like, we finally are getting what we want, but it might be taken away from us at any moment. It's like they can't help themselves, but put themselves in that scenario where they have to leave the door open for something bad to happen. And it's the same thing with the other side of the debate. Every time that they get their way and say like, oh, this thing has this, like they could say, oh, this game has this sexual content to it, but it might get taken away from us at any moment. It's always like that. And it drives me crazy. We can't just enjoy something for what it is right now. So this article already kind of got my attention, but let's go further into it and actually talks about the article itself. I'm going to skip some of it to get to the point where they actually talk about this. So Last year, our 5th year of collecting data from E3, we concluded that for all the increased awareness and conversation about representations of women in games that had occurred over the past decade, in terms of the raw numbers, female representation was just not getting any better, with only a paltry 5% of games featured as last year's event, specifically focusing on female characters. That's good, like the sentence structure. The problem is what comes next. Now here's the good news. Statistically, this year represents a significant improvement, with about 18% of games shown featuring female characters. In fact, this represents a new high, almost doubling the previous, in brackets, dismal record of 9% from 2014, our first year collecting the data. Now here's the problem. They just said that it was 5% of gamers last year specifically focusing on female characters. Now here's the issue. The rest of this paragraph does not clarify that in the same way. It just says 18% of games shown featuring female characters. The other side that they are opposed to, this being the Feminist Frequency writing this article, because I think it's, yeah, we have Feminist Frequency. So whoever wrote this article, which I think it's listed here, Carolyn, oh, there we go. Anita Sarkeesian and Carolyn Pennant together. I don't know if Carolyn's part of Feminist Frequency. I would imagine because they say we here that would be the case. But when they write this part, they should know better by now that somebody will clip this part of the paragraph out. People who hate Feminist Frequency. I don't hate, I just don't I don't like the way that they go about their messaging a lot. I still agree with diversity and inclusion. That part will never escape me and will never go away. I don't like the way that they kind of go about their business sometimes. So again, specifically, they left a really easy open door here for the anti-SJW community, or specifically the sexist community, that really dangerous community out there that we know exists that send a lot of threats to women, that are very harassing to women. This gives them a little bit more ammunition because they can take this part of the paragraph out, completely superimpose it as its own thing and say, see, they only believe that 18% of all games featured women, and ignore this graph here that they put that shows 54% on top of that gave you multiple options, which means a total of 72% of games allow you the ability to play as a female character. And if you also include another 3% on top of that, you could say that 3/4 of all games allow you to play either as a woman or as someone who is non-binary or trans. So specifically, 23% of all games allow you to play as just men. The other 77% do not. That should be a very positive thing. Instead, the way that this is written gives those people who are not going to take this with any amount of clarity and just skim the article are going to find that one thing that makes them mad, and they gave it to them. Quite easily, in fact. So that was my first problem. And again, it's like, it's really easy to just say 18% of games now feature specifically a female as the main protagonist, while on top of that, 54% also give players the option to choose their gender, thus meaning that 72% of games allow us the opportunity to play as a female in said game. If they had done that in this paragraph, this looks amazing. Because again, 72% of games right now can allow you to play as a female. If you are a woman in gaming right now, like a female gamer, or even a woman in the industry, that is a huge statistic. Considering the best one before that, so let's do the math actually. So in 2015, it was 9% plus 46, so that's what, 55? 2016 would have been 51, so it went down. 2017 went up to 59. 2018 went to 58. So it was roughly between 50 and 60% for a 4-year span. And then last year, we suddenly went from under 60% all those 4 years to over 70%. We hit 71, and this year we're now at 72. That's really good. That's a huge improvement. If you think of the worst possible number, which is 51% here in 2016, in just 4 years, we upped that by almost 20%. Actually, wait, 51 to 72. We did. We went over 20%. That's incredible in such a low amount of time. And in fact, that's probably about the sweet spot. You can maybe try to hit it up to maybe 80% at most. Any more than that, and I think you still have to open the door for the possibility of games that are specifically one character and one gender. I think, honestly, the best case scenario I would like to see would be 20 and 20 for each female and male, and then the rest be a choice. I would love it to be somewhere around the 30 to 40% of games are specifically one character, and everything else allows you the ability to choose. That's a great, like, balance. So, all in all, I'm not criticizing what they are doing, like what they're trying to say here. Specifically, I'm criticizing the way that it's written because, again, you're opening that door, which is a huge mistake. Anyways, completing this article here. This year also marks the narrowest divide between games featuring defined female protagonists and games featuring defined male protagonists we've seen. So again, they go right back into it here. But how many guys do you think are going to see this thing, and I'm talking guys that oppose this, and are going to see this graph and stop? Because now they have everything they need. They don't need to go any further. They're done. If you had just done, instead of this specific part of the art of the paragraph, put that in on top of it, they have nothing. They have nothing. They have nothing to give. But you gave them that option. Anyways, I'll just start from the top again. This year also marks the narrowest divide between games featuring defined female protagonists and games featuring defined male protagonists that we've yet seen, with games starring male characters making up 23% of this year's total, or just 5% more games overall. In previous years, there have always been at least 3 times as many games centering men as there were centering women, so the fact that this year both values are at least the same, at least in the same ballpark, is definitely a welcome development. Again, the verbiage is definitely a welcome development. It's not a development. It's happened. Again, stop making it sound like it's a welcome development. Makes it seem like, well, it's okay. No. This is amazing. You should be praising this and not anything else. Stop playing the negative thing like it could change. If it changes, then criticize it. But the fact that is, look at this, within 5%. Within 5%. That is a great gap. Compared to 9 to 32, 2 to 41? That's amazing. We went from that to this. Why are you complaining? Why are you leaving the door open that, oh, it's probably going to get changed though? Don't do that. Celebrate this. Enjoy it for what it is, because who knows, if you are right and it gets taken away, then that's when you focus on it. But when you do this, you leave that door open that you just sounds like you're bitter still. I hate that. I hate that. Because it makes it seem like you don't value that change at all. And again, it continues. However, while we should perhaps be cautiously optimistic about these numbers, we also shouldn't break out the champagne just yet. You break out the champagne. You fucking break it out. Because if it fails, if it goes back down, well then guess what? It'll go back up eventually if you fight it again, and now you get a second bottle of champagne to open. Just enjoy it. It will naturally require another year or two before we can begin to determine if the shift reflects actual change that are taking place or if 2020 is a one-off statistical anomaly that will quickly see a return to the status quo. Again, why do we have to just immediately imply that it could just be a fluke? Don't do that. Don't do that. You're just downplaying the amazing progress that we made. That's what makes people think that there's no point in making progress, because you're not going to be happy about it. That's what a lot of people, myself, used to be this way. I used to get so upset. And you'll see that in the video that I have way back in the day where I talk about one of her videos where I say, why can't you just be happy? And I hate people for that. Just be happy about it. But they can't. Reasons to question whether or not this shift represents widespread change include the fact that more than 1/3 of the games centering female characters came from just one event, Sony's June 11th presentation dubbed The Future of Gaming, the first ever event focused on the games of Sony's next generation console, the PS5. We'd like to hope that this means that Sony recognizes that a significant percentage of potential PS buyers are women, and that they featured those games as a part of a conscious ongoing effort to win over those players. Don't disagree with that. I do think that because, again, we are consistently getting better and better at being more inclusive for women and non-binary and trans people for that matter, that, yeah, you do want to kind of show a little more things in that direction because you want them to think that it isn't just an all-male console and, you know, you should just deal with it. No, it should be like, hey, we're making this for you too, so we aren't forgetting about you. Makes perfect sense. Don't disagree with that. A new console generation could bring about significant change, and Sony's influence within the games industry is vast. The PS4 has sold more than twice as many units over its lifetime as Microsoft's competing Xbox One, so if this does reflect a larger strategy on the part of the console maker, the repercussions in years to come could be very significant indeed. Our hope is that both Sony and Microsoft make more deliberate efforts within their upcoming next-gen consoles to dismantle the false but enduring notion that gaming as a cultural domain is primarily for boys and men. I used to hate that sentence. I don't disagree with it now. I've kind of opened up to the fact that, yeah, this is a very male-dominated hobby still to this day. Why? Because, again, to this very day, I can count on one hand how many friends that I have consistently talked to in gaming. And I think the number is 3. So when it comes to women, it's still very rare that I talk to them consistently while I'm playing video games. So yeah, I can kind of figure that over the 20 years that I've gamed, the fact that I have had 3 consistent friends that are female that are related to my gaming hobby, yeah, that gives me a pretty good indication that it might actually be a male-dominated field still to this day. So I'm not going to disagree with that. Such a shift would require not just a change in the content of games, but also in who holds positions of leadership and creative decision-making within game studios. Historically, these have been overwhelmingly male-dominated, a problem with repercussions far beyond just matters of representation, though the past few years have brought about the beginnings of a much-needed reckoning with all these imbalances of power and their consequences. While it's impossible to discern anything concrete about whether or not more women are being hired at big studios, and whether their cultures are undergoing any real change, from video presentations like these, we can take note of who gets to represent these companies on camera, and in regard this year's events cast a dim outlook and illuminate an area still needing considerable growth. Overall, only 23% of on-camera presenters in these showcases were women, and in each presentation, women were outnumbered by men by at least 2 to 1, and sometimes much worse than that. We'll note changes happening when we start seeing more women, particularly as creative directors of studios or project leads of major titles showing up in these videos. So there's the graph there. I don't know if this specific number is bad or not. This is the one thing that I don't actually have an answer either way on. Because it could also be a thing that maybe just some women are more uncomfortable with public speaking. I have no idea to discern whether or not that it's just because male or men are dominating. It's very possible that it might not be the case. In fact, the worrying part too, and this is again what I talked about, we don't want to push people through the door, is that this number may actually be larger than it actually would be right now, but people are being forced, and I mean forced as in women are being forced to speak because they want to make it seem like their company is inclusive. My worry is that 23% is actually less because some women are being pushed to be the presenters because they want to make it seem like they care. So in reality, it might actually be less, but let's just assume that it's 77 to 23%. If that's the case, again, I don't actually know if that is bad or not. Because the reality is a lot of times when you do presenters, more often than not, they end up being, it isn't just like the company head. Sometimes it's like one of the programmers or like the lead developer or something like that. Sometimes it's positions that are still a male, I wouldn't say dominated, but it's still like men are more often not geared to that position. Because in the same vein, you could say, just as an example, like there are more women in education or nurses, for example. So it would make sense that if there are more women in those fields than men, that women would more likely be geared to be those presenters for that specific subject. So I don't know if this specific statistic needs to be like split 50-50, because I don't know if you literally let things go as open and diverse as possible, if there were literally no restrictions on, like, if we're talking things like affirmative action, if people aren't feeling like they're being forced to go into a specific field or they're forced to hire specific people, I don't know if the gaming industry would suddenly be a 50-50 split. For all we know, if we literally just left everything alone, if we were as open and inclusive as we possibly could be, it might still be 75-25 men to women. We don't know. So I get why they're saying what they're saying here, where they're saying, hey, maybe things would get sped up if we had more women in these roles. I don't disagree with that logic. However, the only question I would ask is a diverse split, as in an equal split, something possible without it being forced? That's my question. And I don't know if forcing it makes the issue better. I don't know if that actually fixes the problem or just creates new ones. So that's my only take there. This is a part where they kind of go after me a little bit, and a lot of people like me. Each year when we present this data, some people invariably point to the fact that games which allow players a choice between a male and female character, or games in which you control an ensemble of characters made up of people of different genders, make up the biggest percentage of all, 55% this year, and wonder why that isn't on its own enough to satisfy us. The answer is quite simple. Of course, we welcome games that allow players the option to create and customize their own characters, but this is categorically different from games that feature defined specific characters. Each person who plays Horizon Zero Dawn, or for instance, or The Last of Us Part 2, must step into the shoes of a defined female character and experience the game's effort to get them to identify with and relate to that character. In an industry whose output was for decades dominated by male heroes, what we most want to see is a shift towards at least an equal number of games that require players to take on the role of humanized female characters. So two things. One, you basically have that now. Almost an even split between defined characters, where it's one specific. So your argument here is now invalid. Quite frankly. Because if you think a 5% split is as a big split, it really isn't. Compared to 2 to 41, 7 to 26, 8 to 24, 5 to 21, no, those are big splits. This is not. So right now, this specific year, you have exactly what you want. So when people point that out, because again, it goes back to what I said earlier, where they have that one line where you can isolate it and say that 18% of games showed female characters, people can take that out of context. Where the reality is, like I said, it's 72% give you the ability to do so. And again, like I said, that's big. So the second point is I don't like that they say, you know, you have to have a defined female character for people to be able to identify and relate to that character. There is a game out there called The Fucking Sims, where you can create your own character, create a legion of characters, and there are endless people that play those games that identify and relate and put themselves into various characters in that world that they chose themselves. Same with games like Final Fantasy games, for example, or any JRPG has several characters in them, and people will gravitate to certain characters because, again, they identify with and relate to that character. So the argument that it has to be a single-charactered game is preposterous. That's not true. That's an absolute flat-out lie. You don't need that. Yes, Horizon Zero Dawn and Last of Us Part 2 are great for that. Because, again, it is specifically that. Horizon Zero Dawn is one of my favorite games ever now. Aloy is one of my favorite female characters, if not my favorite female character in all of gaming. And again, just because it works with her doesn't mean it's the only situation that can apply. How many of us have played games like Saints Row? And whatever we created, we had so much fun going nuts with and feeling like by the end of it we could relate to some things with that character and we viewed ourselves as that character. It isn't something that's necessarily defined by a one-person charactered game. It's not always that. So for them to say this tells me that, again, and I've said this before about Anita, I'm not convinced to this day that Anita actually is even a casual, I think at best she might be a casual gamer, but really isn't as in-depth as she seems to claim she is. Now, again, I'm going just on my own perceptions of her, so I may be wrong. But the language that she constantly uses and the language the Feminist Frequency as a whole constantly uses makes me wonder if these aren't people that play games as much as somebody like I do, as somebody like a lot of hardcore gamers, and it doesn't necessarily just mean guys. I don't know if they take gaming the same way that we do. I think they may be looking at it from a much different perspective, from a much more minor audience. Now, I'm not saying their views don't matter. What I'm saying is if they want the industry to change specifically to their views as a whole, I think that's an issue because all of a sudden they then gets taken out of the hands of a much bigger majority. Now, if that majority was completely hateful, I would say a different story, but I don't believe that the vast majority of gamers are the hateful people that would send people like Anita bomb threats, death threats, all that shit, you know? That's a different story. But in this case, whatever they advocate for, I think is one step too far. I think what they honestly fight for in the end is still very admirable and is something that I hope that we get to. But I think at the same time, there are certain things that they say that I go, whoa, let's kind of hold it back a little bit here. Pull back just a tiny bit. Anyways, let's finish off this thing. While we believe that increased and improved female representations in games is vitally important, it's also necessary to note that it's just one of many things to consider as we look for games to tell stories that represent and humanize a far broader spectrum of humanity than games once did. Better representations around race, sexuality, and gender identity are also crucial, and a great deal of work remains to be done in those areas as well. I agree. I played it and they feature it here. Tell Me Why is a fantastic game when it comes to dealing with transgender, non-binary, those kinds of characters, or I guess those kinds of people. Those work really well. The more games like that I would love, because again, didn't take me out of it to be playing as a trans character the entire time. It didn't do anything to change my opinion of anything. I didn't go, oh, I can't associate with this. It's just another human being, folks. It's not that hard to figure out. It's the same thing with race. It's the same thing with gender. It's the same thing with sexuality. They're all human beings. They all share a same conscience like we do. You don't have to suddenly go, well, that person's black. I could never understand what they go through. That person's a woman. I could never understand what they go through. That person's trans. I could never understand. No, it's really not that hard to understand human emotion. It's pretty basic, guys. It's worth noting that this year's games, Last of Us Part 2 and Tell Me Why, both feature trans characters, and in recent years, non-binary characters have also appeared in games from time to time. Naturally, this is a trend that we hope to see become far more common, and it's something we will be keeping our eye on in the years to come. Is there anything else? No, not really. So all in all, for as much as I like about this article, there's enough that I still criticize. Not because I disagree fundamentally with, like, I'm not going in here the way that I would have probably done 5 years ago, where I said, fuck these people, they don't know what they're talking about. Now I'm just like, okay, it's like just from the top again, you left a really significant open door for people to criticize. You really underplayed. Like, basically there's three, okay, you know what? There's 3 points really in this entire article that I have to go at. One, you left a lot of open doors for the anti-SJW community, and specifically the very hateful and harassing version of that community, to really go out there and take shots at you again because you gave them the fodder, because you didn't proofread your stuff and leave nothing to them. You left them plenty to work with and plenty to isolate. Secondly, you made the distinction that there needs to be a lot more presenters and a lot more people within the industry. And like I said earlier, I don't know if that is necessarily the correct method, because again, if they're looking for a 50-50 split, that may end up being something they'd have to force, which never fixes the problem. If you let it go naturally, it may stop at 30-70, may stop at 35-7 or 35-65, may stop at 55-45 women to men. I don't know, but the idea that it has to be better, I don't necessarily agree that that's the case. Now, if it was 5% to 95, I think we have a different story. But like I said, 23 to 77 is not as significant a gap as you would think. Because again, we don't actually know how it's geared to in the industry, because we don't know how much is open door and how much is closed. So, and again, like I said, we don't even know how many of these women out of that 23% were forced into that role because they wanted to make it seem like the company was diverse and inclusive. So it's really hard to really know if that number is true and if it's the right number or not, and if it needs to get better, or if it's maybe too high for what it actually represents and what it will represent in the end if we were really as open and as inclusive as we can possibly be. So that part I didn't quite appreciate, but again, I'm not nearly as upset about it. The last thing, and the most important thing, is really just, again, the idea that they can't just accept that a good year happened and celebrate it. Like I said, the title literally could have just talked about how amazing that part is, but it had to go right back into, but this might change and we might get fucked again. I am not what I consider to be a feminist. I support women's rights, I support LGBT rights, all that jazz, but I don't go to the feminist thing because that word has been dirtied for so long, both by people who actually associate themselves with the branding of feminism and on the other side from years of criticism against them. So I don't like calling myself a feminist, even though that I probably support 99% of the things that a feminist would want. But it's this specific kind of feminism that I can never get behind. The kind that just can't accept that when something good happens, they just celebrate it and leave it at that. Instead, it's say, well, this is good, but one of two things. Either it's good, but we have more work to do, or this is good, but it might be a fluke. And they might come back and take it away from us. I'm going to say this one more time. We had a fantastic year. Don't piss that goodwill away. Don't screw it up. Because a change like this can be easily taken away, like you say. But it's not going to be because men are fighting back. It's going to be because people feel like you aren't grateful for it. And people feel like you don't care that we made this progress. I say it so many times when I'm talking about, very specific political issues. We are always getting better. We are better than we were 50 years ago. We are better than we were 20 years ago. We are better than we were 10 years ago. Hell, we're better than what we were 5 years ago. And if you can't accept that, well, there's a problem. And if you immediately say, but we have more work to do, again, no shit. There's always work to do. But if you can't go, if I say things are better than they've ever been, and you immediately go, we've got work to do, but don't start that by saying, yes, and it's amazing that we are where we are, then there's a problem. Because it makes it seem like you don't care about the progress that we've made. It seems like you don't care about the fight that we've done. And that is why these movements that are against you in every way continue to exist and continue to thrive. Because when progress happens, you don't go, okay, thank you. This is what we wanted to see. Now let's work on the next thing. You go, all right, what's next? You ignore the progress. And stuff like this article, makes me believe the same thing. That Anita Sarkeesian either straight up just doesn't care about this issue and just wants to be the one who controls stuff, or quite frankly, is just very ungrateful and only cares about the money that keeps getting put into her bank account. Because that company makes non-profit company has way too much money for what it's actually supposed to be. A non-profit should not be as rich as it is. But regardless, to encapsulate everything, 2020 has been, despite all the negativity that we have had this entire year, a breakthrough year for diversity and inclusivity in the gaming industry as a whole. And we should celebrate that. And when people like Anita and the Feminist Frequency group as a whole have to immediately resort to, but there's either more work to be done, or but this could be taken away from us, and it could be a fluke. That's the kind of shit that makes it a fluke. And if next year is a massive downtrend, it's not because men fought back. It's because people like you, Anita, screwed it up for the rest of us because you just couldn't accept progress and be happy about it. That's the reality.